The Civil War, where brothers fought against brothers, was the bloodiest war in all of American history. Slavery was a main instigator of the war, which started after 11 states seceded from the Union. The North wanted to sustain a union. The South wanted to preserve their way of life. And so brothers of opposing views went to war. Approximately 620,000 people from both the Union and Confederate armies were lost. During the span of the war, soldiers suffered many horrors and problems.
The hoarse and indistinguishable orders of the commanding officers, the screaming and bursting of the shells, canister and shrapnel, as they tore through the struggle masses of humanity, the death screams of the wounded animals, the groans of their human companions, wounded and dying and trampled underfoot by hurrying batteries, riderless horses, and the moving lines of a battle of perfect hell on earth, never perhaps to be equaled, certainly not to be surpassed, nor ever to be forgotten in a man's lifetime. It has never been effaced from my memory day or night for 50 years.
In both armies, regiments carried little to none cooking equipment because it would weigh them down, so they were unable to prepare proper meals. Transported foods were mostly canned goods and salted meats, which had a long shelf life. Salted pork, which was a soldier's main source of protein, was horrendous. Hair, skin, and dirt was left on it. When in enemy territory, soldiers did not hesitate to raid farms and households for foodstuffs, yet it was looked down upon by commanders. Armies were not always guaranteed a supply of food. Preserving and transporting food proved difficult for both armies. For the North, one of the most important food staples was hardtack, which was cheap to make, easy to transport, and did not expire quickly. Because of this, it was commonly known as teeth dollars, sheet iron crackers, flour tile, ship's biscuit, or hard bread. Although the North's food was tasteless and horrible, they still had an ample supply of food. Merchants often sold canned fruit, sugar, tobacco, and coffee to the soldiers. Those who were ill at Washington Army Hospital received fresh fruit from Lincoln. Volunteer nurses baked goods, such as gingerbread, to patients as well. Confederate soldiers were not as lucky, and more than often were starving as they fought in the battlefield. A Confederate soldier's diet typically consisted of sweet potatoes and foraged food. Foraging was an important task for soldiers, but it was prohibited. However, officers usually looked away when soldiers foraged. Among things soldiers foraged for were berries and wild game. Unlike the North, no merchants offered goods to the South, so instead they relied on Southern farmers who would give them an occasional offering. At the beginning of the war, items such as boots and heavy overcoats were thought necessary. Heavy boots were seen helpful because they were more durable and protective. Heavy sweaters with buttons and a long skirt seemed more comfortable for soldiers. Worn over all of this was a heavy, long overcoat. The soldier carried a 15-pound knapsack containing what were seen necessities, such as string, pipes, and utensils. As time progressed, the clothing choice was shown to be unhelpful to the soldiers. Boots did not provide comfort, and a soldier could easily twist his ankle. Boots were replaced with high-ankle shoes called brogans. Short-waisted jackets also succeeded the long-tailed sweater, and felt hats replaced hard caps. Comfort and light luggage was seen more important than having necessities in the Civil War. The largest killer of soldiers was not bullets but disease. Over 120,000 people died from action, but over 180,000 died from illnesses. Diseases occurred because soldiers came from rural areas and not exposed to diseases like chickenpox and mumps. Death also resulted from constant exhaustion, lack of adequate clothing, exposure to severe weather, and a diet of poorly cooked food.
Excerpts from a Civil War diary of Captain James Wren, August 12, 1862, campfront of Fredericksburg. We left our men behind here sick. Robert Campbell, Joseph Kirby, Thomas Connell, and Samuel Stanley. We left this camp evening at 6 p.m. We started the march and continued it until 3 in the morning of the 13th and took no nap until 6 a.m. and started again on the march and marched all day long until the evening of the 13th and put up for the night and resumed our march again at Ryeville, which was at 4 a.m. of the 14th, and reached the railroad station at 11 a.m. of the 14th. During the night it rained very, very heavy, and having no tents, it was rather disagreeable.
A large number of soldiers also died from malaria. This was the result of sleeping without mosquito nets. The most common diseases were diarrhea and dysentery. Civil War doctors did little to cure sickness. They prescribed morphine and opiates because they knew that it would temporarily relieve the symptoms of many illnesses. Because of its anesthetic effect, it was commonly rubbed in severe wounds. However, it was highly addictive and soldiers acquired long-lasting drug habits. Because the Civil War used soft-lead bullets, the wounds that were left were often splintered bones and large holes in the body. Because of this, doctors often amputated as quickly as possible to minimize suffering and blood loss. Doctors often used chloroform and ether to numb patients.
The leg's gotta go. Ready? A visitor to the hospital witnessed the most gruesome of treatments in a surgeon's tent. In the operating tent, the amputation of a very bad leg was witnessed. The surgeons had been laboring since the battle to save the leg, but it was impossible. The patient, a delicate-looking man, was put under the influence of chloroform, and the amputation was performed with great skill by a surgeon who appeared to be quite accustomed to the use of his instruments. After the arteries were tied, the amputator scraped the end and the edge of the bone until they looked quite smooth. While the scraping was going on, an attendant asked, "How do you feel, Thompson?" "Awful," was the reply, and this answer was returned although the man was far more sensible to the side effects of the chloroform than he was of the amputation.
Typhoid resulted from soldiers drinking from contaminated water by latrines and rivers that had dead bodies and human waste. Uncooked meat caused many cases of disease as well. Regular soldiers who had been trained to be more careful about food and water were less likely than volunteer soldiers to catch diseases. A large number of soldiers died from tuberculosis. However, a large number of soldiers were discharged for poor health and died later on.
We'll give him a hearty welcome, then hurrah, hurrah, all the men will cheer, the boys will shout, the ladies they will...
Most males who went to war were leaving wives, mothers, and daughters at home. While farmers' wives were more accustomed to taking care of the family, families that depended on industrial life suffered. This was especially hard for fathers and sons who worried about the well-being of their loved ones. Ironically, though soldiers fought to prevent a divided house of the nation, their own households were being torn apart by war.
We'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home, and we'll all feel gay when...
Brothers of opposing views were forced to fight against each other.
Families struggled to maintain ties of kinship by sending letters and keeping family pictures. However, the mail system was not stable, which led to letters often being sent to wrong families and persons. Soldiers feared dying away from family more than the terrors of battle. In an era where aspects such as last words and departure on deathbed were seen extremely important towards the afterlife, dying at war was frightening. Soldiers often obtained good deaths by repenting their sins and writing about their last moments.
In Camp Clark, Washington, July 14, 1861, Captain Sullivan Ballou writes back to his wife, "My very dear Sarah, the indications are very strong that we shall move in a few days, perhaps tomorrow. Lest I should not be able to write again, I feel impelled to write a few lines that may fall under your eyes when I shall be no more. I have no misgivings about or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter, and I am willingly, perfectly willingly, to lay down all the joys in this life, till it maintain this government and pay that debt."
Rebellious strife, and we'll all drink stone wine when Johnny comes marching home. And we'll all drink stone wine.
At the start of the war, many men on both the North and South were very confident in victory of their side and voluntarily enlisted. However, as time passed by, the North realized they needed more force to deter the rebels. Oftentimes, soldiers enlisted in the militia to collect money. Once they were given their dues for enlistment, they immediately deserted their regiments. On April 15, 1861, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to join the Union Army, realizing that there would be no quick or peaceful resolution to the secession crisis. Under Lincoln's orders, Secretary of War Simon Cameron issued an appeal for state army men to be immediately detached from the state's militia in order to serve as infantry or riflemen for the Union Army for 3 months.
Sir, under the Act of Congress for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions, etc., approved February 28, 1795, I have the honor to request Your Excellency to cause to be immediately detached from the militia of your state, the quota designated in the table below, to serve as infantry or riflemen for the period of 3 months, unless sooner discharged. Your Excellency will please communicate to me the time at or about which your quota will be expected at its rendezvous, as it will be met as soon as practicable by an officer or officers to muster it into the service and pay of the United States. At the same time, the oath of fidelity to the United States will be administered to every officer and man. The mustering officer will be instructed to receive no man under the rank of commissioned officer who is in years apparently over 45 or under 18, or who is not in strength or vigor.
Many Irish and German immigrants joined the Union Army when the news of war was out, believing they would gain American acceptance through military service. Because of previous nativism and American patriotism, immigrants had a hard time dealing with tensions. Others fought because of idealism. For example, many Germans fought to abolish slavery, but most immigrant soldiers sprouted from the need of employment. The Union Army offered a generous bounty of cash for those enlisting. Because of these reasons, immigrants made a huge portion of the Union Army, with about 170,000 Irish immigrants and 200,000 German immigrants.
On July 17, 1862, Congress passed 2 acts allowing the enlistment of African Americans, but official enrollment occurred only after the September 1862 issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. 14 regiments of blacks were issued during the Civil War, yet they still faced discrimination. A black private received $4 less than a white private, and it was hard for blacks to gain ranks as officers. Blacks were not even considered to fight as well as whites. Yet African Americans were able to prove these thoughts wrong. The 14 regiments displayed extraordinary courage and commitment. 25 black soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the highest honorary achievement in the Army.
Our presidents, governors, generals, and secretaries are calling with almost frantic vehemence for men. Men, men, send us men, they scream, or the cause of the Union is gone. And yet these very officers, representing the people and the government, steadily and persistently refuse to receive the very class of men which have a deeper interest in the defeat and humiliation of all rebels than all others.